And we titled this discussion as The Sufi Paradigm, Vernacular and Colonial Impressions in Sindh. And I hope it gives the same impression. We are holding this session in collaboration with Decolonial Dialogues that Ahmed Mevan is coordinating. And I'm pleased that we have joined hands, and we hope to organize some more of such webinars and interact with each other on some very interesting topics, including decolonialism and caste and identity in Pakistan and South Asia. As far as IPS is concerned, Michel Boivin knows, Dr. Reid knows, and others who have been with us earlier in a previous webinar, that we have been working on socio-cultural issues, but the issues related to caste, identity, and Sindh, we are obliged, and we owe our thanks to Dr. Sufi Hussain. He's been instrumental in bringing our focus to this area, and among all those who are present here, online or in this room, I'm the person who knows least about the subject. So after my welcome, I hand over proceedings to Sufi Hussain for moderation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nadeem Bhai. I will not take much of your time. I would just simply... I would not take much of your time. I would just simply, introduce the author's biography, academic and scholarly biography, and the panelists. So, Professor Michel Boivin has an extraordinary scholarly and academic profile, and anyone familiar with the syndicate world knows very well Michel Boivin himself and his work. Michel Boivin is a French historian and anthropologist who specializes in South Asia, trained in contemporary history, Islamic studies, and ethnology. He is currently director of research at CNRS, French National Center for Scientific Research, and a member of the CEIAS, Center for South Asian Studies, at the School of Advanced Studies in the Social Sciences, EHESS. He is co-directing 3 seminars at the EHESS, History and Anthropology of the Muslim Societies of South Asia, Authority and Politics in the Sufism of South and Central Asia, and Material Culture and Devotion among the Shia Societies. In addition, he contributes to the organization of 2 CEIS research groups, Vernacular Cultures and New Muslim Elites, with Julian Lewis, and Gujarati and Sindhi Studies, Societies, Languages, and Cultures with Pierre Lecherer. After having devoted several years to the study of the Ismailians of these regions, he shifted his focus to Sufi groups. He directs a research team on history and Sufism in the Indus Valley at the CEIS. From 2008 to 2011, this team has worked as an interdisciplinary and international project centered on the Sufi site of Seven Sharif. One of his most recent research interests is in Hindu Sufism in Pakistan and India. Despite his emphasis on historical anthropology, Michel Boivin continues to work on the appearance of new forms of knowledge in the 19th century. He is particularly interested in the production of new culture in the Sindh province as a result of interaction between British colonial rule, the emergence of new elites, and the objectification of Sufism. His work is therefore to be understood as a continuation of post-colonial studies as he is engaged in reconstructing the evolution of the Sufi culture of Sindh, based on archival work carried out in the Indian subcontinent and in Europe. During the last year, I have picked up this information from his biography, but to which year about he's talking, he knows very well. He used to imply iconography as a meaningful data to fill gaps resulting from the lack of written resources. Michel Boivin teaches historical anthropology of South Asia at EHESS Paris with a focus on the syndicate area. He created in 2008 the Mission Interdisciplinary, in short form MIFS, and electronic news, and signed an MOU with the Department of Antiquities, Government of Sindh. The same year, an electronic newsletter was launched. In 2010, MIFS became a registered NGO. In France, in 2011, Michel Boivin started the Center for Social Sciences in Karachi with an MOU with the Alliance of Franchise de Karachi, which was hosting the center. The same year, he funded the CSSK series with OUP Pakistan. It is still way too long. A lot of work Michel Boivin has done, and we are very proud of him, and because of his work on Sindh, and we have been very much, informed about history and historiography, the resources to which we Sindhis, those who are working from within Pakistan, have not access. But Michel Boivin has made easier for us to understand and analyze further, to relate this wonderful historiography of colonial Sindh with present-day, contemporary society and politics in Sindh. So this was in a brief, his scholarly biography, and he has written more than a dozen books. The list provided by his website is about 16 books to his credit, and several book chapters and also articles. So, among the panelists, we have Nukhba Taj Langa, Ahmed Mehman, Rafiq Wassan, and Uttara Shahani, all doctors, and Professor Manan Ahmed Asif and Masroor Shah may also join us at some point. We hope so, because we needed a historian as well, a particular trend historian. So I asked him, but I hope that he will also join us at some point. Then Masroor Shah is a young scholar. He does some work in Sindh, and he has also taught and read this book, The Sufi Paradigm, so we may also take him. Nukhba Taj Langa studied MA in Colonial and Postcolonial Studies at the University of Warwick and completed her PhD from University of Leeds. She joined Farman Christian College in 2009 and is currently serving this institution in the capacity of Associate Professor of English and Dean of Humanities. In addition, she is a freelance translator and political activist, and as far as I know, she is also very much connected with the Sraiki movement, and she also works also very much interested. The way she formulates Sraiki culture and society resonates with the way Sufism and Sufi politics are also constructed in Sindh, probably. So we would love to know more about how both correlate in the context of Michel Boivin's work. Ahmed Mehman is a PhD. Dr. Ahmed Mehman is a PhD from University of Kent Law School. Within this project, he's currently exploring critical history of networks in international law and their violence. And he's also collaborating these webinars that we have, designed. And also, we will writing some blogs and some papers as well regarding or related to different webinars, mostly focused on Sindh and Punjab, Southern Punjab, Gujarat, and all neighboring regions, their culture and society and politics. Rafiq Wassan holds MSc in Anthropology from the Qaeda University in Islamabad, Pakistan. His thesis is based on ethnography of hereditary caste musicians in Sindh, Pakistan. From 2012 to 14, as an activist anthropologist, he was engaged with art and music for peace and human rights cultural initiative by Saranga Society, a Hyderabad Sindh-based literary and cultural organization. Since September 2015, he's following his interdisciplinary doctorate studies in the fields of anthropology, ethnomusicology, and cultural studies under the Swiss Government Excellence Scholarship Program at the Institute of Musicology, University of Bern. So I know Rafiq Wassan as well. I have also keep reading his work. He is a prolific writer and an activist, intellectual activist as well in Sindh, as far as Sindhi society is concerned. Dr. Uttara Shahani is ESRC postdoctoral fellow at the Faculty of History, University of Cambridge. She is affiliated to the Center of South Asian Studies, University of Cambridge, and a postdoctoral affiliate at Trinity College, Cambridge. She is a historian of South Asia with a primary focus on Sindh and the Sindhi diaspora. Her PhD thesis was on Sindh and the partition of India. Her current research is focused on the Sindhi diaspora in the UK more broadly. She works on histories of partition, citizenship, refugees, migration, and ecumenical traditions of religious practices. So I I believe that all the panelists, their work and their focus area correlates with, resembles with the work Michel Boivin has already done, and I think every scholar on the panel will certainly will be citing or taking inspiration from the work of Michel Boivin, and we have a lot to learn in this webinar from all the panelists. Now, I would just send a few words from Michel Boivin. So before beginning or asking Ahmed to begin, I will ask Professor Michel Boivin to say a few words, so 4 or 5 minutes, so that just we can then begin further.
Okay, so thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to discuss this book and also some of my achievements. No, what I can say is a kind of, I can explain what was my intention in this book, especially briefly, of course. Yeah, first, what I want to underline is that this book, for me, belongs to the field of historical anthropology. And as you can see on the book, there is a period on which my study focuses. It is from 1851 and 1929. So almost a century back. So in historical anthropology, of course, our work is related to a number of obstacles we have to deal with. And for example, there is the issue of sources, of starting with written sources, because of course we cannot construct our reflection without sources. So it is a first point. And when you are working on the 19th century, and also I want to precise, it's not only about South Asia, because of course I know also to some extent the history of Europe, but even in Europe, in France, for example, most of the people, the huge majority, were illiterate. Even in France, the huge majority. So this is a big issue to deal with, because all the culture, literature, tradition, they were transmitted orally only. So how to deal with? And if still I focus on France, it is not before the end of 19th century, early 20th century, but it really started after the First World War that French scholars started to take interest in this agriculturist, all these backward people, because they used to call their own population illiterate, poor, exploited, oppressed population backward too. So this is very important. So of course, for doing this study, my study was depending on the sources, and mostly it was written sources, of course, British sources in archives or in published works, and also, but not before the, I would say, the 1870s, 1880s, when the Sindhi intellectuals, and one of my theories that there was a new intellectual group among the Sindhi, I call intelligentsia, started to publish, started to reflect on their own tradition, religious belonging, social tradition, this and that. So this issue in historical anthropology is very important. And it is also why, as you say in my profile, which need to be updated, but I am the only responsible, I turn to material culture to see to what extent objects, including built structures, can help us to deal with this lack of sources, you see. Okay, but it was not especially the case for this book in particular. Yes, and also in my book, I wanted to give a kind of new perspective about the interaction between the colonizer, the British, of course, and the local population. Of course, I was deeply influenced from Michel Foucault to Edward Said and the post-colonial studies, because what is important also to know is that these Sufi paradigms, and even if maybe one of the foundation is the publication of the Shah Joli Salo, the printing in 1866, never ever the British were really interested by Sufism in Sindh, never. And if Sir Bartle Frere, the commissioner in Sindh, asked Enstrom to print this, it was for the British officer to learn Sindhi. It is written in the introduction by Enstrom. So never for them, and I put it in the book, Sufism was a non-topic, a non-issue as such. Of course, they were interested by the dominant classes dealing with the Dargah, the Sajadanashin, because they were powerful, but they were only interested with power. And where they were dealing with local population, it was, of course, with the most powerful groups, and they wanted to build a kind of alliance between them for the control of the country and of the population. So yeah, what was also an interest in this construction of the Sufi paradigm was to deal with knowledge as power. Of course, it is not at all a new topic, because I quote already Michel Foucault, Edward Said, and all the school of the Columbia University, and without talking about subaltern studies, etc. But so it was also to give this new perspective through a case study, Sindh. What I want to do, yeah, and also something very important for me is to contextualize the case of Sindh, because I observed that very often Sindhi studies are, how to say, are located in the Sindhi perspective. Of course, but it is the case in all the territories, in all the region, in all the countries. But, you know, there was the building of a kind of mythological representation of sin. For example, the tolerance, thanks to Sufism, this and that. And also, to some extent, my aim was to deconstruct this mythological representation of Sufism. And also, finally, what I want to say is that my book doesn't claim to deal with Sufism itself. It deals with an intellectual representation of Sufism, which will be used by the new elite, and they'll sell finally for legitimizing their own growing power in the context of Sindh province. No, also something I want to do is because also among scholars, there is a kind of theory according to which Sindh and Sindh culture, Sindh identity is at the crossroads of Indic and Iranian civilizations. So I don't agree, because I agree, of course, that finally Sindhi identity was built as a distinct identity. And if you refer to Indic, Iranian, this and that, it is obvious that there was everywhere on the planet always a circulation of immaterial goods of cultural pattern. It is a fact, of course, but I think it is not relevant to present Sindhi identity or culture as a kind of mixture of Indic this and that. It is for me an autonomous field. Of course, Sindhi culture shares some features with neighborhood region from Balochistan to Gujarat, this and that.
Thank you so much, Professor Michel Boivin, for this very brief summary. And obviously, of course, I also went through the book, and you have, explained the representation of Sufism, the way the intellectuals of that era vernacularized the British Orientalist traditions. So now over to Ahmed, and we will.
Sufi, thank you, Professor Michel, so much for that really wonderful introduction. I think it's a very good segue into some of the points that I want to kind of bring up as well. Just some of them, not all of them. But I just wanted to kind of really congratulate you on this like absolutely brilliant book that I have actually learned a lot from. And just to say a few words where what I kind of in my own reading thought was the one some of the things that I think were interesting and were important interjections that you've actually done. So at the heart of the book, I really find the archival material that connects and brings forward the discursive origin of Sufism within Sindh and Sindhi context in a way that you're talking about. And since history, at least during the British colonial rule, to be one of the most important kind of contributions that we can see that is not present within contemporary literature. And I really do appreciate your point about furthering and perhaps using Foucault and Said together, which is also very interesting, using both of them, thinking and being influenced by both of them together. To give us an almost a different perception. And I know that you just said that that's not entirely what the book is about, but then nonetheless, it kind of gives us an interesting peek into how do we define in this contextualized, localized sense what Sufism is and its intellectual representation that carries on between a connection between British colonial knowledge production and how what you refer to as the Sindhi intelligentsia then carried on for their own position, how they carry that knowledge in their own production. In a way, then I suppose this particular interaction that you're talking about goes a bit beyond what post-colonial theory does and talks about this knowledge production throughout this particular historical period of colonial rule as a collaboration rather than just simply a linear knowledge construction or orientalization. So from that particular point, which I think is really interesting, I think that one of the things which is really crucial for me over here, and I was wondering how perhaps a lot of the terms used in the books could perhaps be redefined or looked in a slightly different way if we simply look at what you start to do in the introduction of the book, in the second chapter of the book, which is place yourself, and I know this is what you are doing now, place yourself in terms of how is it that you're understanding this term Sufi. And so that brings me to the conceptual and methodological concern is that there are central concepts throughout the book that you've used to advance the argument of the shift from colonial knowledge production to vernacular knowledge production. And I wonder if at all there was a deconstruction of those terms, how would they look like? So I'm obviously speaking of how you define religion, how you would define what is indigenous, who is native, how do we understand Muslim and Hindu and caste? And caste is also mentioned in both Hindu caste and Muslim caste in that particular relation. So in the first place, I think kind of the questions around these terms and the usage of the terms is, to me, at first and foremost, it's a methodological question about the research. And I know that you say you're going beyond post-colonial critique and then kind of looking at Foucault's idea of episteme to define Sufi paradigm, and you go into archives to do that to present a complicated story. So So perhaps another provocation that I'd like to raise is what if the way in which we were looking at these archives that you have so brilliantly looked at, we could look at them in through a perspective of decoloniality. And here, when I say decoloniality, I don't mean in a way that post-colonial literature poses it as this nationalist kind of anti-colonial sense. But I mean, when we look at the archives, how do we look at the construction of the archives and what the construction in of those archives is missing in terms of its silences? So what I'm referring to is said by a lot of indigenous scholars and research methodology that's done by African American scholars like Sadia Hartman or Maori scholar Linda Twahay Smith. And what their contention is often that historiographies that look at archives simply look at what is discursively, textually present and intellectualized within the archives, but not what is not in the archives. And of course, a lot of the archives that you have looked at, from my understanding, are kind of British archives. And I know that there are some points at which you've kind of also brought these things up in terms of the limitations of that and everything. But within the context of the subcontinent, I think that there, in fact, when we look at the silences, there are scholars within anti-caste scholarship, Romila Thapa, Gail Omwith, Gopal Guru, amongst a lot of anti-caste scholars who have pointed out the silences in the historiographies that are constructed by post-colonial scholars, where the continuity of caste as a central underlying social category throughout the history of the subcontinent is missed completely. And what that does is kind of ends up invisibilizing the voices of historically marginalized caste communities, and also how the category of caste and the conceptual and the material kind of deployment of caste operates to construct historiographies, to separate these other concepts that we think exist in isolation to caste, like religion, like Hindu. I mean, Hindu, for example, Hinduism is very taken aback by the use of the word Hindu and Hinduism in that context, because a lot of anti-caste scholars have pointed out how Hinduism in itself, in a way that we now understand it, is not a religion per se. And they've given very good, interesting evidence to suggest that it was also a collaborative construction of an orientalization as well as a self-orientalization at a particular point by what we now refer to as Hindu reformers. And then pushing through that particular kind of perspective of anti-caste scholarship, I wonder then how we can also look at the construction of religion within the subcontinent, but also outside of it. How is it that we define religion? Is it through the Christianized, secularized understanding of what religion is, and then how we understand the divides between Sikhism, Muslims, Islam, and Hinduism within the context of the subcontinent and its historiography? There's obviously also a critique of understanding Islam as a religion that's been presented by a critical Muslim studies scholar and Latin American scholars who've written on the critiques of Christianity and secularism. So I do wonder what those kind of interjections would actually do to advance some of the really interesting archival work that you've presented over here and really interesting suggestions that you've done over here. So taking this question of caste in specific relation to Islam and Muslims a bit further, I do think that some of the things that you've said are really interesting, particularly how you've talked about the Sindhi intelligentsia being a declassed kind of minority elite community that started to kind of construct this literature and use a particular kind of way in which British colonial knowledge was looking at this literature as a way to advance their position. And I know at certain points you have talked about caste in relation to Muslims when you've referred to it at Ashraf and Ajlaf, but I was hoping to see a bit more kind of elaboration and a bit more centralizing that argument of Muslim caste within the subcontinent with reference to scholarship of some people who are already here, including Julian Lewis and Ghulam Hussain and more recently Masood Alam Falahi, kind of recognizing the fact that within the context of subcontinent, there are characteristics of the way that Sufism is understood, for example, tasawwuf, that have very, very strong parallels to how caste is reproduced and interjected within Islam through the concept of Sayyidism. And so lineage-based superiority, spiritual superiority, and dogmatous relations, and division of laborers. So that was one thing that I found very interesting, because I thought what you're doing is essentially presenting the Sindhi Sufi paradigm, which is a local contextualized understanding of how Sufism is carried out through these particular intellectual minority elites. And I think in a lot of ways, perhaps that is consistent with, even though I know that you've said that you're not trying to comment on Sufism per se, but I think that there are parts in your book where you've spoken about the broader conceptualization of Sufism, and the fact that this book is not about that. But there are some hints as to what those are. For example, could it be that Sufism is linked to Greek thought, or is it kind of an oriental construction, or is it somehow collaboration or intellectual representation? And I wonder how that sits between us understanding the fact that, as Alex Nish has recently written on his book on Sufism, that Sufism is contextualized locally, it's malleable, it's not fixed. And so when we look at it transhistorically, conceptually, how then can we understand even the Sufi paradigm in this particular case that you're talking about beyond just an intellectual representation of the minority elite? For example, bringing caste here again, how do scheduled caste communities have their own understanding of Sufism? Is this actually in Sindhi? Is this is the Sufi intellectual representation that you're presenting actually of what we would refer to as within kind of Dalit activism, in particularly Sindh, of Savarna Muslim understanding of the Sufi paradigm? And does that include more than just the minority D-class elite that you've talked about? What other kind of caste communities does that include? So those are some of the provocations that I know that I don't necessarily have an answer to it, but I think these are questions that can be pushed further and thought about a lot more when engaging with this question of Sufism in the context of Sindh. I think that's about the end of my comments.
Thank you so much, Ahmed. You have raised some very pertinent queries, and I myself also believe that perhaps Michel Bowen could further engage with the Sheldon Pollock. He has actually also built his theory on the work of Sheldon Pollock as well, the historian of ancient India, you can say, and he's also he has been very critical of Brahmanism. So perhaps in certain ways, Michel Bowen could also be a bit critical of Sayyidism, which is embedded in the Sufi paradigm. Anyways, we will further listen about this once the panelists finish. So over to now, Tara Shahani, please.
I am not supposed to answer some comments for later.
If we begin in the middle, then it will go forward. So we will give in the end. Yes, thank you.
Uttara, please.
So I'd like to begin by thanking Michel for writing this fantastic and exciting book that creates an intellectual genealogy for the Sufi paradigm in Sindh, a region on which a lot of historical work remains to be done. The book is a richly textured and historical anthropological account drawing on a wide range of sources. I know Michel said he had lots of problems with sources, but for me, the use of sources was fascinating. There is an abundance of material to work through here, but for me, one of the many important contributions that this work makes is that it forces us to rethink histories of religious community, particularly in 19th century colonial India. Scholars have overwhelmingly focused on reform and revival movements, and within that rubric, we have accounts emerging of the construction of a more uniform and muscular revivalist Hinduism, especially, but also of more defined modern forms of Sikhism and Islam, and of a clear dichotomy emerging between Hinduism and Islam. A feature of the reformist and revivalist movements, as Michel points out, is that reformers spoke of the religious life of Indians as corrupted and recast their traditions to perform a so-called purification process or to valorize a certain text or certain traditions reinterpreted through a colonized lens. Michel draws attention to the objectification of the Shahjo Risalu by the emerging Sindhi intelligentsia as the central text of Sufism in the 19th century, to be followed by some others, such as Sachal Sarmast in the 20th. But despite this privileging of a central text or texts and the simultaneous presence of revivalist movements in Sindh, both indigenous and imported, like the Arya Samaj, particularly in the first half of the 20th century, I think the Sufi paradigm urges us to think of a different idea of religious modernity emerging in Sindh and forces us to reflect on the nature of religious modernity in colonial India in more complex ways. Recently, Richard Weiss has done this in a very different context from another so-called periphery in his study of the teachings and institutions established by the 19th century Tamil Shaiva poet Ramalinga Swami. Michel has analyzed the production after Richard Burton, the Orientalist soldier ethnographer of a Sufi paradigm in Sindh, and the objectification of a Sufi literature by the colonial administration, albeit inadvertently. At the same time as Burton sought to locate communal identities within his notions of difference and race, and notes that Sindhi religious practice is impure and corrupted, somewhat contrarily, he was enormously fascinated by the heterodoxy of religious practice he encountered in Sindh. Despite the evident shifts towards a more hermetically sealed communal identity, various Sindhi literati had attempted from the late 19th century onwards to affirm a Sindhi Sufi in quotes culture of in quotes unity or universalism. As Michel shows, the production of this literature survived the period of high communalism of the interwar years, even in the 1920s, where you have a lot of these books being published. The intelligentsia behind this literature were largely, and for the historians in the 1920s, is the period of the consolidation of communal nationalism. The intelligentsia behind this literature were largely from religious minorities, which I found fascinating, including the Aga Khani Khoja Hashim Lalu, the Itna Ashari Shia Mirza Khalid Beg, and the Amil Jetmal Parsram. The writers invested in the Sufi cultural identity of Sindh approached the question of religious belonging and modernity in their own ways and with differing emphases. As Michel shows, it is impossible to reduce this prolific corpus, even of only a single of these authors, to a standardized reading. Nonetheless, they can all be said to have located Sindh and Sindhi's difference, in quotes, in a certain universalism that was beyond what are thought to be normative 19th century understandings of religious traditions, even as this literati privileged and located Sufism within aspects of their own religious traditions. Mirza Khalid Beg, for instance, took a deep interest in Muslim reformist movements that were establishing themselves in other parts of late 19th century India and that were, alongside Hindu movements, seeking to establish more codified, nationalized, and hegemonic versions of Hinduism and Islam. Nonetheless, he indicated that Shah Abdel Latif, considered by Sindh's literati to be Sindh's foremost Sufi poet saint, was simultaneously a devout Muslim as well as one who existed between religions. Ultimately, in these interstitial spaces, there was nothing or no religion. For Khalid Beg, Latif was a perfect Sufi who had achieved union with God and gone beyond religion. Latif might therefore be perceived as a kafir by those unfamiliar with Sindh, but was emblematic as the soul of Sindh, in quotes. So this clearly pedagogical relationship, the audience for the Sindhi literati was educated Sindhis and the British, but also clearly a colonial reading public outside of Sindh, to whom their works were addressed in a pedagogical tone, explaining Sindh's culture to outsiders who might not understand that Sindh's distinction lay in its, in quotes, mystical culture. What meaning does the word mystical have here? It appears to be code for an intertwined religious culture which was not the same across communities. So it's not to suggest that Hindu and Muslim and all the castes across communal lines were the same, but not mutually exclusive either. So the question I have here is, are we seeing alternative modes of religious relationality that are being emphasized or being proposed in 19th and early 20th century Sindh that do not conform to how we have understood religious revivalism dominantly in the mode of homogenization and codification? Or were there parallel and perhaps paradoxical processes of the codification, homogenization, and categorization of religious categories, communities, and caste alongside a more resistant Sufi paradigm? Another extraordinarily important aspect of this work, which I think will have repercussions, indeed it must have repercussions for related fields such as partition studies, which is my field, is that the Sindhi literati producing the Sufi paradigm were not from the traditional elite, but new, perhaps more differently upwardly mobile social classes. The paradigm was not advanced by the traditional bearers of Sufism, such as the Pirs. This new intelligentsia of Sindhis did not seek to build a nation, according to Michel. To quote Michel, the meanings and implications of the paradigm were intended to build a community, one whose characteristics were rooted in a vernacular culture on the one hand, but on the other hand, in the vision of universal brotherhood made possible by the Sufi paradigm. The Sufi paradigm will ultimately be overtaken by the development of communalism and nationalism, and therefore will have failed to counter the split between Muslims and Hindus. But it is also members of these new social classes, such as Hassan Ali Effendi and others, who start heavily investing in the idea of Sindh as a region, as a geography, and the region as a geographical marker of religious community. One can see this process perhaps achieving new and more consolidated contours in the 1920s and 30s. The Sufi paradigm might have tried to escape the political order, to use Michel's word. I really like that phrase. But I also wonder if it perhaps inadvertently contributed to this territorialized vision of Sindh that increasingly gets communalized. For instance, Jetmal Parsam distinguishes Sindh from the rest of India because of its traditions of interconnected religiosity. Sindh's difference lies in Parsram's eyes, not in the distinction Richard Burton makes between Sindhis and outsider Hindus, for example, but between Sindh and the rest of India, indeed the world. For Parsam, what is needed, but the rest of the world did not understand, was Sindh's mystic self, and it is this self that distinguishes it from other geographies, including India. Finally, another important aspect of this work, through its close readings of the different texts that make up the Sufi paradigm, is that it allows us to think not only of the Sufi intelligentsia as characters we study, but as providing an intellectual framework in how we think uh, of our own majoritarian and violent contemporary South Asian present. I don't wish to romanticize them, but perhaps we could recover their work as offering different possibilities of thinking both about the alienations of colonial rule and the post-colonial present.
Thank you, Uttara Shani. It was a wonderful summary as well as some commentaries and a bit of criticism as well. I would now ask Professor Nakbal Langa to please comment upon it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm sorry I couldn't unmute myself. So thank you, Professor Michel, for inviting me here, and Mr. Sufi and IPS. I just want to add one more thing to my introduction, that I'm also Professor Michel's student because he mentored me for my postdoc. So obviously, because he's been my mentor, I feel quite honored that, he thought of me and invited me. So I'm going to start with my point of entry in Professor Michel's research. Although I'm not an expert on scholarship on Sindh, but I've been quite inspired, at personal level and academically and culturally, of course, and of course, because I've been following Professor Michel's research quite closely. And I find a few points which kind of intersect with my research. And I want to start by appreciating them as an important contribution from Professor Michel. The most important one being the critical study of colonial discourse and how it impacted indigenous cultures like Sindhi and many other cultures. By that, I mean what Professor Cohen terms as invading the epistemological space of the local cultures or local people as the process of, as the colonials established the process of colonization. Secondly, I'm interested in his tangible and tangible and intangible aspects of Sindhi culture, which he talks about, and using the example of Sufism and Sufi paradigm. And interestingly, one example through which he starts his book is the image building. And image building through the example of the Shrine of Seven or Khwaja Khizr. And a lot of these colonial processes rely on image building a lot, you know, and in terms of building a positive image of the colonizer and negative image of the colonized. So in that respect, this is one example of what I'm trying to explain through tangible and intangible culture. Thirdly, Sufism representing both culture and identity. And fourthly, ethnography and interdisciplinary approach and beyond, moving beyond the text. I think archival research is really important, but I was very interested in the autoethnographic element of the work, because Professor Michel talks a lot about how his interaction with, for example, bards or you know, people belonging to the local culture resulted in this research. So I think that is equally important, particularly when we are talking in terms of defining, identifying culture and talking about regional identity or Sufistic elements of Sindhi culture. And finally, of course, my point of entry was also the connection with Indus Valley civilization, particularly due to my own background, because of I belong to Saraiki culture, and there are close ties between Saraiki and Sindhi. And moreover, I think the interesting part that I already mentioned, you know, talking about tangible and intangible aspects, and when he gives the example of the shrines and how the colonials created images through which they could assert their colonial authority more than, and treated these buildings as symbols of antiquity more than appreciating the local culture. That is a very interesting point for me. And I'm interested in his bridging of the visual and the textual, as for instance, also argued by an American scholar named W.J.T. Michel, who builds this, who talks about how the image can elaborate what the text cannot. So basically, he says that both image and text complement each other in order to understand these complex discourses. By discourse, I mean, in the sense as Michel Foucault has defined a discourse. So how these visual and textual create and complicate these images, particularly when we are talking about the question of power and hegemony. And in that respect, I find his research very interesting. And I think if it was only an archival research, it would have been, or a research based on the uh, analysis of literary texts, it wouldn't have that depth and diverse approach that he is trying to achieve through the discussion on visual and textual. And the most important questions that he's asking, that what is knowledge in the colonial perspective and how does it marginalize the vernacular knowledge? This is a key question in my view. However, I would like to add to this, and I would like to ask him this question, although he's already defined that, he's looking at a particular time frame, which is 1851 to 1929. I'm quite interested in finding out that how uh, two important things. Firstly, based on this idea of uh, knowledge building through colonial process, that how has this impacted, how do you see this impacted, uh, having a long-term impact on Sindhi culture, for example, even in the post-colonial era? And if you've reflected on that, and or whether you want to do it in future. Um, so that's one question. And the other question that I had in mind was also that how do you think, although you've talked about Sufism as a form of knowledge or episteme, and from what I understand is that when you define Sufi paradigm, it combines culture and knowledge. But and you've talked about how Sufi paradigm within the context of Sindh has actually reflects uh, different religions. It is not sticking to uh, Sufi Islam, but it is also bringing in or pulling in a lot of other religious dimensions. But what about other, like beyond Sindh? What about the regions beyond Sindh? How does Sindhi Sufism or Sufi paradigm, how can it be understood by through approaching other regions? Or, for example, in Saraiki cultures, Sufism is also a very important part of cultural identity, and as a symbol of it is a symbol of identity, culture, and region, for example, that we regard as Vasid. So this is one question I had in mind, and then I'm not going to go into the detail of. I think Mr. Maiman has quite elaborately talked about classes, and Miss Shahani as well has in-depth knowledge of Sindhi culture, and she's a scholar on Sindh. But I think beyond the class system and structure, I was also very interested in key research gaps that I thought that this book is filling. And most importantly, I think this is about the objectification of Sufism that he discusses with reference to Shajo Risalo. And what he means by that is perhaps that the depth and the spiritual dimension of Sufism is not understood, but Shajo Risalo is used as a text to teach colonials Sindhi language. So despite the fact that it reflects some kind of appreciation and acknowledgement of Sindhi language, there is no acknowledgement of Sufi philosophy, which is this is one of the gaps that I've identified. And the other is the idea of cultural antiquity. I think it's really interesting because cultural antiquity is more important for the colonials as compared to the cultural philosophy. So that's a fascinating idea, and I think it's very interesting how he has addressed it. Then key and primarily when he points out that how key works by colonials neglect this idea of cultural philosophy reflecting through the Sufi paradigm. This is one thing that he's aiming to discuss throughout the book. So these are the main ideas that I had in mind, but also I wanted to reflect a little bit on because Sufi mentioned that I belong to I speak Saraiki is my mother language, and I am a Saraiki activist as well. That despite the commonalities between Sindhi and Saraiki, my work is very contemporary. I think there is no comparison, and Michel has done a remarkable work despite the similarities of oral respect for oral tradition and culture, language, and ethno-linguistic identity, even in Saraiki culture. So it is very interesting that we built that bridge through our research. But I would really appreciate if Professor Michel can address this question. Again, I'll repeat. One was that how can Sufism in Sindh can be seen beyond the borders of Sindh and connecting with other Sufi, other cultures which also practice Sufism very strongly within, at least within Pakistan. And the second I wanted to ask again was that how do you think that the impact of colonial policies that you've observed during this period also seem to reflect even in the post-colonial era? Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Professor Nukba Langa. And Professor Nukba has raised some very important, you know, propositions, I would say, like future implications of this study, and if we are expecting a sequel of this historiography because it covers a particular era in the colonial, period. But we would also like to see how it can be, applied or understood by the contemporary historians of contemporary Sindh, contemporary Sraiki Belt, and particularly those who own it, like Sindhi nationalists or Sindhi civil society or progressive circles. So it will be very interesting and fascinating how Michel Bowen further advances this study, and we would, I myself believe that there is a possibility that some other work can be done to cover further decades that follow. So we would further listen about this from Michel Bowen after the Rafiq Wasan. Rafiq Wasan, presents his ideas about this. Thank you. Rafiq, please.
Yeah. Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. First of all, thank you so much, IPS, and especially my friend Sufi Hussain. You actually invited me to be part of this very wonderful discussion panel on Professor Michel Boivin's very fascinating work, the Sufi Paradigm and the makings of vernacular knowledge in Sindh. I really find this book very fascinating and inspiring because it really closely resonates with my work, as Sufi Hussain already knows about my work, because I'm also working on the progressive cultural production of Sufi heritage in Sindh. That's in the context of post-colonial, post-independence Pakistan. So I do understand the very significance and importance of the work by Professor Michel, although he has covered another century before partition. So first is Professor Michel himself identified in his introductory note. I think I should start with this comment. As he said that his work is mainly within the field of historical anthropology. So because as I also belong to the field of anthropology in the Pakistani context, I think this is very important field which also serves a great purpose in terms of providing new insights in terms of the field of historical anthropology within the context of Pakistani universities in the anthropology field. Because in this book, the way Professor Michel Boivin has focused on the materiality of Sufism, like material culture, that is archives, archival material, and institutions. That is really missing in the dominant anthropological fieldwork, anthropological, conceptual, and methodological inquiries within Pakistani universities. For instance, in the dominant anthropological inquiries in Pakistani universities, we only still focus on, so the popular perception of anthropology is to focus on lived experience. But I think the Professor Michel Boivin's work on Sufi Paradigm, which really focuses on materiality, material culture of Sufism, like archives, archival institutions in the paradigm of historical anthropology, that is really good for the field of anthropology, if the students of anthropology can learn from this book. So I think in that respect, this book is really a significant work to learn from, especially for the students in Pakistan. Now coming to the points, I have actually, when I read this book, I actually pointed out and noted down few points. is I also said that I am also working on the progressive culture production of Sufi heritage, and that mainly focuses on the progressive intellectualization by Sindhi progressive intelligentsia in post-colonial Pakistan. So I do understand the very importance of this book with this very idea. But I have actually, on a very critical note, if I should start, this whole idea, the main thesis of this book by Professor Michel that focuses on building of knowledge in colonial context. The main argument which he builds in this book, to me, this very idea of makings of vernacular knowledge in colonial context, or the building of knowledge in colonial context, seems a bit problematic in the sense that when we talk about vernacularization of Sufi heritage or Sufism, then I think this whole idea of vernacularization of knowledge of Sufism, then it reduces the Sufi knowledge production that really contingent to the colonial knowledge or colonial context. Is if Sufism only appeared or was made appeared in colonial context, or the colonial knowledge made it. So when we say vernacularization or makings of vernacular Sufi knowledge, then I think we reduce it to the colonial context only. Because I know different paradigms, especially within the cultural studies, if we, because I'm also using interdisciplinary paradigm in my work, like it's not only the colonial context that made Sufi paradigm, but I think if we use the term traveling concept, you know, there's a lot of work within cultural studies. So there is a long traveling history of Sufi paradigm or Sufism within the subcontinent. So it's not only the colonial context that formed the Sufism. So I would say if we apply this whole idea of traveling concept, so the whole idea of Sufism has traveled over the centuries after the adventure of Islam in the subcontinent. So the making of new vernacular knowledge of Sufism in Sindh, of course, I understand that the colonial period has a lot of imprint and impact on the formation of Sufism. But if we only focus on this idea that only colonial knowledge produced the Sufism, I think that would be only the kind of, we will reduce it. It would be a kind of reductionist approach towards Sufism or Sufi heritage. Then another argument, which I also find very fascinating by Professor Michel, that he says that his main argument in this book is centering the debate from production of colonial knowledge to the vernacular knowledge in Sufism. So in that context, again, I would say, I think the vernacularization of knowledge, in this sense, the vernacularization of Sufi knowledge should be seen, should be interpreted or conceptualized in the sense of vernacularization of Islam over a long period of time. The way Sufism has a long trajectory, long traveling history that makes it or transform it into a vernacular knowledge. Hybridization and syncretization of knowledge of Sufism when Islam enters into the subcontinent. So it's not the only European colonial knowledge context that kicked off the construction of Sufi paradigm, but I argue that the vernacularization or vernacular knowledge making of Sufism are generally religion, Islam in subcontinent, or languages, the local languages, if we say Sufi language, they take place within the, they doesn't take place within the singular colonial context. This is my, I think, on a critical note, this is the main idea. Then I think third point, which I also find very inspiring by Professor Michel Boivin, that is also, there's the concept of he uses from culture to episteme. Like he takes the very idea of Sufism as a knowledge or episteme. I think this is very important concept because even in the popular discourse in Sindh or generally in Pakistan, Sufism is generally considered by many critics, by modernist critics, by religious modernists, by rationalists, by secular nationalists, that Sufism is just only about the Sufi orders. Sufism is only about hereditary peers. Sufism is only about these manipulative Sufi authorities. But when Professor Michel Boivin has used this term, Sufism as a episteme, I think this is really a good idea, good conceptual intervention, I would say. That's how I'm also using in my work, this progressive culture production of Sufism. So like in Sindhi context, this whole progressive intelligentsia in the post-independence Pakistan, for them, Sufism is not really about Sufi peers. Sufism is not only about Sufi authorities, or Sufism is not only about Sufi tariqas as generally considered or conceived within the Western scholarship on Sufism. So this is how also I intervened within Sufi studies in Sindh, that how a rich repository of material culture of Sufism in the form of archival institutions. Maybe Professor Michel Boivin must be familiar with other archival institutions, like in modern institutions, like in universities in Sindh, you will find the Shah Latif chair in Karachi University. You will find such a chair in Shah Abdul Latif University, Khairpur. So these archival institutions, the cultural institutionalization, which I said, the progressive intellectualization and progressive rationalization in the making of modernity, and Sufism is very much a very important variable for Sindhi intelligentsia, progressive Sindhi intelligentsia, in the formation of Sindhi identity. So when Sindhi progressive intelligentsia talks about Sufism, for them Sufism is really is a cultural intellectual practice. It's not only about the devotees and peers and the peer and murid relationship, but it's really about the intellectualization of Sufism. For instance, I give you an example. We spoke about the caste. So for instance, how this whole progressive intellectualization of Sufism in Sindh takes up the very modernist rationalization questions like gender, feminist question, caste question, class question. For instance, when I was searching the archival material at Sachal Research Chair at Shah Abdul Latif University, Khairpur, I found from 1980s onward a rich repository of this annual magazine, which is published on the annual festival of Sarchal Sarmas, that's called Sarmas magazine. So in mid 80s, one Sarmas magazine, I found a poetry by a contemporary young, those times, he's still alive. So he's still very active, Sufi writer, progressive writer, Akhtar Dargai from Rodi. And his grandmother was also a Sufi singer. So I found his poetry, he used in his poetry a kind of anti-caste narrative through Sufism. So using the Sachal Sarmast language, he used anti-caste narrative in Sindhi society, that how Sufism is against caste hierarchy. So what I say that this is how Sindhi intelligentsia has brought in this whole modernity narrative through Sufism. So I think this is very important aspect, which I try to link with Professor Michel Boivin's work, that how Sufi culture is really an intellectual episteme, a critical episteme. So that I'm also using it. So I think I see some resonance with these concepts. Then I think Professor Michel Boivin has also spoken very well, articulated this idea of agents and actors in the making of knowledge. I think I find Professor Michel Boivin's work very comprehensive, very articulated in the way he has articulated this whole, all aspects. Like my major focus is on performance tradition. So how when he speaks about agents and actors, so he is also identified. So like he quotes, then he visited Dargah Jog Sharif and he spoke to the bards and musicians. I remember when I was doing my ethnography on Manganhar musicians, once I went to the Dargah Jog Sharif in 2004 with Ustad Shafi Fakir, and he is one of the chief Sufi performers, Sufi Ragi of Jog Sharif. And that was my first encounter at Dargah Jog Sharif, and I really found this rich repository of performance tradition. So I'm trying to link this whole idea of the agents and actors. So it's sometimes it's not only the modern, rational, educated agents and actors who are in the making of Sufi paradigm. But I think in Sindh's context, these oral tradition, the performance tradition, the bards, the storytellers, the musicians, the manganehars, they are also very important, significant actors and agents in the making of Sufi paradigm. So I think within the context of Sindhi Sufi paradigm or Sindhi Sufism, Sindhi Sufi culture, we cannot at least reduce, or we cannot essentialize all these categories like secular and sacredness, the tradition and modernity, the oral versus written, or the performance versus written. So these all categories are mixed. These all categories are like overlapping somehow. So we cannot really differentiate these categories in a very well-mannered way, like sometimes people do. So I think, so this idea of agents and actors in the work of Professor Michel Boivin in this book is also really very important. But like I'm working on within the paradigm of ethnomusicology or anthropology of music. So I think I would say this is very important aspect to analyze Sindhi Sufi culture when we are talking about the Sufi paradigm. Then we will have to give priority to the performance tradition as the like agency, agents and actors in the making of Sufi paradigm. This is very important aspect, because sometimes our scholars, the rationalists, they do not focus much on performance tradition. So in the making of Sufi paradigm, performance tradition, the music tradition is equally very important, and sometimes more important than written documents. Even in today's Sufi festivals, which are really the major actors and agents in the formation of Sindhi Sufi identity, the three big festivals, the Kalandar Lal Shahbaz Sufi Festival, annual festival, Shah Latif's annual Sufi Festival, Sarcha Sarmast Sufi Festival. I think if we omit these three Sufi festivals, I think this whole Sufi paradigm, in the current context, would be collapsed. So the importance of Sufi paradigm, so it really is a organic form of, so performance tradition has a very organic role in the formation of Sufi paradigm in the current context. So this was my actually a point which I added to this discussion panel. I think then this class analysis, yes, class analysis made by Professor Michel is also a very important point which he has identified. Like I think it also relates with the agents in the making of like Munshis. I think he has discussed in detail. Yeah, I think these main points which I reflected instantly when I read this book. So I would say I think this book is really an important work within the field of historical anthropology. But as I already said, so within the field of ethnography, within the field of anthropology, so focusing on this archival institutionalization, materiality of Sufi culture, I think this is very important aspect which has been addressed by Professor Michel, which I am also working on. So I think I should stop here.
Thank you so much, Rafiq Wasan. It was a very rich, review and commentary. And it is very interesting that you find similarities, theoretical similarities between your progressive cultural Sufi production and the the notion of the Sufi paradigm, the Sufi regime of knowledge as an episteme. So it is very interesting, but you are at the same time also a bit critical of reductionism of sort somewhere, but we will further listen about that. And also, it was also very interesting to learn from you that there is anti-caste narrative being projected through Sachar Sarmat's poetry. It will be very interesting to learn further from you and to see your work coming in future. So now, before asking Michel Boivin to explain further in the light of this rich debate, I would like to have a short comment from Dr. Saeed Red is with us. If possible, please unmute him. And we have also Sabah Sindri and Julian Lewis, two wonderful guests with us. So maybe Dr. Saeed Red may have something to say, please. Short comment.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Can you hear me now? Okay, so yeah, I will take from, first of all, thank you, Sufi Hussain and IPS for inviting me to this wonderful talk. And it's really, I learned a lot from all of the speakers. And the book is really interesting. My question, which I wanted to know about is the point which Rafiq Wassan has talked about. So basically, what Rafiq Wassan says, nationalist progressive intellectualization of Sufism. This is something which in post-colonial phase, happens, as Rafiq Wassan says. This is, if I can understand, this is more about nationalist tradition in Sindh regarding Sufism, how Sufism uses, how a nationalist element, nationalist parties and nationalist discourse uses Sufism for its own sake. So I would like to ask, whether this kind of nationalist tendency in Sufism was present in Sindh during colonial phase as well. The vernacular knowledge production in colonial phase, can we find the traces of nationalist element, Sindhi nationalist element in that phase, or it was just after 60s or 70s when this came about? So what is the connection of these two different sort of Sufisms, which I can, as I have worked a little bit, I can feel it's a very different sort of set of Sufism which happens world over and which happens in Sindh, and that one which Rafiq Wassan calls progressive intellectualization of Sufism, which is almost the thing which I'm talking about, same thing, I guess. Maybe Rafiq Wassan can also shed some light on that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Said. And we have now currently been joined by Ambassador Abrar, Vice Chairman of IPS. We welcome you on board. And again, a short comment from Julian Lewis, if he is there, please unmute him. If he could. Julian, please. Thank you.
Sure. Hello.
Well,
can you hear me?
Yeah, yes, please.
Hi, everyone. Okay, I'm just going to make a very brief comment because first I need to make a confession. I've only very partially read the book, so I read only a few chapters. But actually, maybe an interesting. I find it very interesting that Michel published this book and turned the idea of a strong connection between Sindhi identity and Sufism and made it into an argument. I find the idea of Sufi Paradigm quite compelling. But just it's interesting that so the idea of working on Sindhi nationalism and Sufism was the initial, I would say, thrust of my PhD when I started. Over the course of time, it was reduced to a smaller portion of my PhD. But in this chapter on Sufism and Sindhi identity, so I adopted a very deconstructivist kind of position, and so I sought to question not only the discourse of the Sindhi nationalists and their claims of this strong connection between Sufi identity and Sindhi identity, but I also questioned the work of some scholars, foreign scholars, who, it was my impression, tend to focus particularly on the shrines of Seven Sharif and Shah Abdul Latif, and tend to ignore other practices associated with Sufism in Sindh. So I don't know. I feel this book in a way is a response to this idea in a way, and I find it really really interesting. And in a sense, my work starts from the 1930s, and so I examine one quite a famous document by Muhammad Ayub Kuro. Of course, it's The Sufferings of Sindh, and that was made public in 1930 to defend the idea of a separate Sindh province. And in that text, there are several paragraphs on the specificity of Sindhi culture, and there is mention, of course, of the Indus Valley and of the Sufi poets of Sindh. So I think what I really appreciate about Michel's work and about this book is that he looks at the preceding period from the mid-19th century to the early 20th century. I think it would be interesting if somebody could write, or some of us could actually do it, or we could do it collectively, but to write a kind of synthesis then that would start from the mid-19th century and to this day, and see the ways and connections and how this idea of a Sindhi Sufi identity evolved over time from the beginning of the British conquest of Sindh to the present day. Thank you.
Thank you, Julian. Thank you for this also very pertinent point related to Shah, Qalandar Lal Shabad and Shah Latif, the overdetermining focus on these Sufi saints, but also Udairulal maybe in certain places. We have also with us Sabah Sindri maybe, and she's doing a PhD under Michel Boivin. Please, can you please unmute her if she can have something to say? Sabah, yes, thank you. Welcome.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so very much, Sufi Hussain, for this very rich discussion. So I'm not specifically working on Sufism, so I don't think I'm the best candidate to talk about it. But you know that when researchers, scholars work on Sindh, they come in contact with Sufism and Sufi literature. So I'm working on the Sami community in Sindh. So as we have already discussed, Michel explained it very well, that we don't have sources to look back in the past to study the history. So working in the case of Samis, I came to know about this Sufi literature, not Sufism specifically, but Sufi literature. So I think that Sufism and Sufi literature are very important, important source to know about the past, to know about the historiography of these groups. So I think, but I have one question to Rafiq Bassan. If he could share that the Seychelles, which he discussed about, anti-caste he has discussed. So it will be kind if he could share it with us. That would be kind. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Sabah. Now over to Professor Michel Boivin. Please, yes. We will take again questions from panelists if they have any kind of, after your commentary and response to their commentary. Thank you.
Yes, so thank you very much to all of you for your comments. And so yes, really it was a very fascinating discussion. And of course, there are so many things we talked about. Frankly speaking, I don't know how I shall tackle them with them, but No, first I want to start with epistemology and especially categories, because Ahmed started with this issue, and also Rafik talked about this issue, and the other discutant also. So of course, it is the maybe main point where we are doing research. It is how we understand things, how we name things, what do we put in the word, the notion, the concept we use. Because we have to know that the concept and the words, they have their own history. And for example, Ahmed talked about I'm using let's say, words, terms such as religion, Islam, Hinduism, caste, class. I confirm, I use them. But another perspective is that, okay, you write a book, you cannot explain all and everything, the word you are using, because otherwise it would be a book in itself. And for example, only I take the word religion. It's also very important to make a kind of genealogy of the word, because we are using the word religion. We know that finally there is no, it is a European word coming from Latin. And do you know what is the meaning, what was the root of the word in Latin? Religere, it means to put things together. What I want to say is that initially the word religion from Latin, it is not a religious word. Okay, to see how the word, the shape, the change, and in the European country, this word became the word to name religion. What initially in Latin, it was a secular word. And also now if you look at how to translate this, because as a concept, it was built by Christianity, then it was transferred to other cultural units, Africa, South Asia, and this. And for example, also, when the first Europeans were working on Islam, they looked for what is the equivalent of religion. And there is no strict equivalent. Finally, through a consensus, they used to say that din in Arabic is a kind of equivalent, but you can use many other words like mazhab and other. And it is the same for the Sanskrit culture, what was the equivalent of religion the Europeans were using. So the issue of category and furthermore of translation, not only linguistic, conceptual translation, always it is a main issue we have to deal with, of course. And there is another thing I want to say in this context. I don't know if you are aware, but during the first Arab dynasty ruling Sindh, the Habarid, it was in the late 8th, early 9th century, when the Amir started to mint coins. You know, on one side, it was in Arabic, on the other side, it was in Sindhi. So on one side in Arabic, they put the Shahada, the Kalma. And of course, there was the expression, Muhammad, the prophet, is Rasulallah. How to translate Rasul in Sindhi? Do you know how they did translate? They were Arab, they were Muslim. How did they translate Rasul into Sindhi? Aftar. We have the coins. We have the coins. So, you know, it is a very important and basic issues we are to deal with, but also very intricate and complex issues. And also regarding, for me, it is related to a main issue, another one. It is even before the 19th century, before the British. Of course, returning to Sindh now, in 18th century, in 17th century and before, what does it mean to be Muslim? What does it mean? What was to be Muslim? And once again, we have to deal with the lack of sources, so to say, because regarding Singh in the 17th, 19th century, we have historiographies and Sufi poetry. But as you know, the historiographer, such as Kani from Tata, they were writing in Persian, not in Sindhi. And so it's very difficult. And of course, the people who are writing, they belong to the higher class. They were Sayyid, almost all of these historiographers. So of course, they never deal with such issues. What does it mean to be Muslim? And also there were so many local population. For them, they didn't even exist, so they never talk about them. But for example, we can find one information about what some scholars, including Anne-Marie Schimmel, I think, call the Nakshbandi Revival. You know, after Shawaliullah, the Mujahideen, Nakshbandiya with Ahmad Serendi and other, okay. So this Nakshbandi Revival reached Sindh in early 18th century, and some Nakshbandi, especially from Tata, from Luari Sharif near Badin, they started to write treatises in Sindhi, and we have the manuscripts, and their main purpose was to teach the Sindhi to be Muslim. What does it mean to be Muslim? Of course, there were the 5 pillars of Islam, this and that. But so if you produce such literature, it's very interesting to see. So for this population, even if they could claim to be Muslim, but for them, what did it mean to be Muslim? Because the Nakshbandi, they wrote treatises in Sindhi, also translation of Quranic abstract in this, to teach the so-called Muslim how to be a true Muslim, this and that. So it's always related to, and of course, about what does it mean to be Muslim? The same question can be asked about the Hindu. What does it mean to be Hindu? Even in the 19th century. Also, of course, there is a huge issue as expressed by the post-colonial studies, and we know Nicholas Dirk's Castes of Mind, when he said that it was a true creation of the British, the caste, and even the word Hindu, when it was coined by the British, but Romila Thapa answered that we can find the mention of Hindu much before the English, this and that. So these are all what I shall call epistemological debates, especially regarding to the categories we are using. But thank you very much for the different comments that were very, very important and interesting. Also, just a precision, because in the book, if I remember properly, I use the word archive, but not with the same meaning, probably that I should have explained more, not with the meaning that Nicholas Dirk, for example. I don't use the word archive only as administrative archive. It is in the general meaning of archives. There are many studies about, but for me, for example, this collection of the British Library I used about books or booklets published in Sindhi from late 19th century. For me, they are archive also in my understanding. So, of course, the administrative archives, they were produced by the British in 19th century, but I'm dealing also with non-administrative archive, especially made of this book published by this intelligentsia from late 19th century onward. Yeah, and something maybe I didn't understand properly, but it is not my claim that the colonizers, the British, produce a vernacularization of Sufism. I don't know, because as I said, the vernacularization, it is another process. But regarding this point also, when I started to talk after you, Sufi, in the beginning of this discussion, yeah, I forget to talk about the issue of appropriation, because what was the result of the objectification of Sufism through especially the printing? It was that this intelligentsia reappropriate Sufism, but under the shape of a paradigm. So I don't think that these British, they started a process of vernacularization. And as I said when we began, especially it is so obvious that for the British, Sufism is a non-issue, is non-existing. That's why I start my book with the depiction of this painting, because when you know Sewan Sharif, you don't understand why this painter, but he was also a British officer in the army, but why, when you go to Sewan, you think of Lal Shahbaz Dargah, and how he painted this. The Dargah is only represented with the huge wall on this side. And even if you know Sewan very well, when you see the painting, you just, what is it? Is it the Dargah Lal Shahbaz? So it was very a kind of allegory of the British representation and relation with Sufism. Yeah, so otherwise, I agree with, of course, most of the comment, overlapping categories, still the categories, not to essentialize the categories, because as I said, the category have their own histories, and of course, they are not fixed. So we have to be very cautious when we use this category. Okay, so I think I'm done. I cannot take in details, but thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Michel Bowen, and we have already, 1 and 30 minutes done. And any comments? We will only may be able to take two or one more comments from the panelists. Ahmad, do you have anything to say, or Uttara, Shahani, or Nukhba? No, okay, then okay. So I think this is too much, and there were a lot of questions that Professor Michel Boivin can respond later on as well. And
Okay.
just a brief explanation, explanation that this program was meant to be live streamed, but because of the issues of consent, because we could not take consent in time, so we have, for the time being, delayed. And after permitted by Professor Michel Boivin and the panelists, we will then further see that if we can put it online on YouTube or anywhere else for other audiences, because it was very rich debate, and we would now ask Ambassador Abrar Hussain to say a note of thanks to the speakers, please.
Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Well, it's participants and especially the speakers, those who participated, those who commented, but most of all, Professor Michel Boivin and all other friends who were there. Well, in fact, it was a very important topic, and I've learned a lot from whatever I could hear at a later stage by joining this seminar. We all know that mysticism has played a very important role in South Asia, in the whole of subcontinent. But then to relate it to some nationalism would be very difficult, because mystics are, the Sufia, they are global assets. Everyone owns them. And they have talked of humanity, they have talked of love, they have talked of harmony. And we know about Rumi, we know about Khayyam and Hafiz, who are very popular in the West. But then in South Asia as well, we have so many Sufia, starting from Data Ganj Bakhsh, then Hazrat Moinuddin Ajmeri and Qutbuddin Bakhtiar Kaki and Fariduddin Ganshakar, and so many of them. But today this was specifically about Sindh. Sindh, as we all know, is Babul Islam. Islam came to South Asia via Sindh, and then Sindh has been specially influenced by this special aspect of Sufism, which is harmony and love. And you will see this among Sindhi culture as well. So this is how mysticism has influenced Sindhi culture also. When we speak of Lal Shahbaz Qalandar or Shah Abdul Latif Bhitai, like all other saints in South Asia, like all other Sufia, their ancestors also belong to Central Asia, like Shah Abdul Latif Bhitai's ancestors, who perhaps came from Herat, or Lal Shahbaz Qalandar. Similarly, all other Sufia in other regions of the subcontinent, they mostly came from Afghanistan and Central Asia. But then, as I said, in Sindh, you will especially notice this impact of Sufism on the local culture. And this all was discussed here in a scholarly way. And I'm happy that I was able to join it and to be a part of it. Well, on behalf of IPS, let me once again thank Mr. Professor Michel Boivin and all other participants who were there today and who enlightened us about a very important, very interesting topic. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you all. So this ends our session, and I look forward to further collaborations in future. IPS and Decolonial Dialogue intend to organize further webinars, and we will again engage any of you or any time. I hope that we will further engage each other. Thank you so much.
Thank you.